Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Philip Benoit, and I'm an adjunct senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, where I lead the Energy for Development Research Initiative. And at this event today, we're going to talk about energy and development. Now, there's a lot of discussion about China's changing role and its impact on trade, security, energy, and climate issues. Today, we're going to discuss where China sits on the development spectrum and why that matters, with a focus on energy and climate. Is China still a developing country, or is it an advanced economy? Or rather, should we view it as a superpower? My colleague, Kevin Tu, and I just published a paper on this summer on this subject, and our conclusion was that it was all of the above, what we call a hybrid superpower. But today, we have the pleasure of hearing the perspectives from a distinguished panel of international experts, to whom I will come back to in a second. Let me first quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. We are very pleased to have joining us for this discussion 3 experts in the field with a rich experience from preeminent institutions. Let me introduce them briefly in the order in which they will present. I am pleased to welcome Ranjit Lamech, who will speak first. Ranjit is currently the Regional Director, Infrastructure, East Asia and Pacific Region at the World Bank. In this capacity, he manages the World Bank's energy and transport investments and advisory programs in the East Asia and Pacific region. Now, that's the World Bank region that includes China. He is responsible for a loan portfolio that totals over $10 billion, with a team of over 100 professionals based in a dozen countries. He began his career with Tata Power in India. He holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford University and one in public administration from Harvard University. Sarah Ladislaw will speak next. And as I will describe a little later, she's at the genesis of this discussion. Sarah is Senior Vice President and Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sarah leads CSIS's work in energy policy, market, and technology analysis. If it comes out of CSIS and it's about energy, you can surely find Sarah's influence somewhere. She is a member of numerous advisory groups, including the National Renewable Energy Laboratories Strategic Analysis Technical Review Panel and the Strategic Advisory Council for Georgia Tech's Strategic Energy Initiative. She has also worked at the US Department of Energy and in the private sector. Sarah received her bachelor's degree in International Affairs, East Asian Studies and Japanese from George Washington University, and her master's degree in International Affairs, International Security from GWU as part of the Presidential Administrative Fellows Program. Our final speaker will be Shang-Jin Wei. Shang-Jin is the N.T. Wang Professor of Chinese Business and Economy at Columbia's Business School, and is also Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia's Graduate School of Business and School of International and Public Affairs. And it's always a pleasure to welcome a Columbia colleague. Shang-Jin is a noted scholar on international finance, trade, macroeconomics, and China. He's a recipient of the Sun Ye-Fang Prize for Distinguished Contributions to Economics and the Zhang Pei-Fang Prize for Contributions to Economics of Development, among other awards. Importantly, for today's discussion, Shang-Jin mixes academic with hands-on development experience. He has held senior positions at the International Monetary Fund and served as the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. He holds a PhD in economics and MS in finance from the University of California, Berkeley. I will now provide a short opening to help to set the context. As I had mentioned, Kevin Tu and I authored a paper this summer called Is China Still a Developing Country and Why It Matters for Energy and Climate, that was published by CGEP here at Columbia. And in fact, some of this analysis started following a presentation I made a while ago at CSIS at the invitation of Sarah, in which I was demonstrating and showing how energy consumption has shifted from being predominantly by OECD countries to being predominantly by developing countries. And at the end of that presentation, Sarah said to me, but is China still a developing country? And as a result of that question, we went out and decided that we would analyze in what ways China is still a developing country and maybe isn't a developing country. Very much an open question. So just to give you a sense of some of the data, what we've seen in China over the last 30 years is a rapid growth into the world's second largest economy. Today, its economy measures over $14 trillion, not in PPP terms. In PPP terms, it's the largest, but in terms of market exchange rates. And what's interesting is if we look back in the history of China, it was only till about 1999, 1998 that China actually qualified under the World Bank's classifications as a low-income country. It moved around that point into the middle-income country, but very much a lower middle-income country, sort of consistent with where India is today. And only starting about 10 years ago did it actually graduate into the upper middle-income countries, where you have, for example, in Indonesia. And that's where it sits under the World Bank's classifications today. But having said that, it is also, and has been for the last 3 or 4 years, bigger than the third, fourth, and fifth largest economies of the world combined. Bigger than Japan, Germany, and the UK or India. I think they're going to be flipping positions. And that's a feat that's only been accomplished by one other country, the United States. But when we look at China, and in some ways reflected in the cover page we have on the one hand, China and the coal distribution at a household level with, at the lower part of the picture, a very modern solar grid in Shanghai. And that very much reflects the fact that in China, there's actually really more than one China. Major income disparities. And what you have here is the income per capita across China's 31 administrative regions. And on the left, you have Beijing, which has the highest, which has an income per capita similar to what we see in Portugal. But all the way on the bottom, to the right, you have Gansu that has an income per capita that's similar to Guatemala. So very much when we look at China, there is really more than one China. There are multiple Chinas. And when we look at the issue, for example, of poverty, and specifically energy poverty, China today has about 400 million people who lack access to clean cooking technologies. That's basically 1 in 3. 1 in 3 people in China live in a household where they lack access to clean cooking technologies. Now, access to clean cooking technologies, universal access, is one of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN to be achieved by 2030. But the IEA estimates that under current trends, China will still have over 200 million people without access to clean energy technologies, even in 2030. So very much a massive energy poverty issue facing China. But at the same time, what we have seen is a China that not only as it has grown, and there have been a rise in incomes, we've seen increasing consumption of energy. What you have here in red is China's energy consumption over time, green, the EU 28, and blue, the United States. China became the largest consumer of energy in about 2011, and basically looking forward is projected to increase its energy consumption year after year, while the United States is largely flattening and the EU is diminishing, to the point that by 2035, China's energy consumption will be larger than that of the United States and the EU combined. So it's consuming a massive amount of energy, an unprecedented level of energy. And that very much then brings us to the next question. As much as we're going to talk about where China sits today, there's always the question of where does China want to go? And where we know China wants to go is to see its income per capita increase, to move ever closer and into the area of advanced economies. But this is an uncertain and little traveled path. Very few countries have actually succeeded in moving from the income per capita levels of a developing country to that of an advanced economy. And those that have succeeded have tended to be very, very small, or have had some unique situation, South Korea being potentially the largest of those, or some petro-states. So what we see when we think about China is we see an unusual history an unusual present, and an uncertain future. And I look very much forward to today's panelists helping us to shed light on this question of where does China stand today on the development spectrum and why that matters. Ranjit, look forward very much to your presentation.
Thanks, Philip and colleagues. While I share my screen. I presume you can see my screen. This topic is an extremely important topic, a topic very close to my heart. So I'm just going to sort of break my comments into three sort of segments. Firstly, whether China is a developing country or superpower, does it matter for energy and climate? And I'll posit that it does. It matters enormously. I will go over a few implications as I see it, energy and climate considerations from the perspective of China and what implications it would have. And then I posit that I would put China and what I refer to it as an innovative and entrepreneurial state on a climate mission. I borrow the term entrepreneurial state from a person by the name of Mariana Mazzucato. I mean, she has written extensively on this topic, and so I borrow the term from her, and she's been an author of a book by the same name. Now, Philippe's paper where he says, is China a developing country or superpower? In a sense, he sort of concludes with the term hybrid superpower. Now, from where the bank sits, the World Bank sits, China is clearly a developing country from the perspectives and for the reasons that Philippe has outlined. But it's more than just a developing country. It has many attributes of a large country, and I'll come to some of the features and why it matters with a large country the size of China, with its domestic market economy size, and with some of its competencies. So from the perspective of climate, I'm going to borrow a quote from the great leader Deng Xiaoping, no less. From a climate perspective, it does not matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And I would submit that China is very capable of catching climate mice, if you want to call it that. What will matter going forward would be China's core climate action targets. I think most of you would be aware of what Xi Jinping laid out at the recent UN summit, that China would achieve zero net carbon by 2060, which is a mere decade after what much of the EU has set its sights on, which is 2050. So this will matter as well as the chosen transition path. And to some extent, the devil is in the detail, and the transition path will matter significantly. Then there are issues about, the post-2020 target. The Chinese 13th five-year plan established a target that China would be a moderately well-off society by 2020. I think China, and I'm sure Shang-Jin and others will probably have more to say on it. I think China seems to be on track to meet that. But again, the trade-offs, as I'll speak about later, between GDP and some of the other trade-offs will be important, and that will matter. What is also going to matter is this debate that will continue within China and elsewhere on what the role of markets versus the role of the state would be in an area as important as climate. I think you will see a mix. I mean, at some level, China has relied on markets in some cases. It's relied on the long arm of the state in other cases. And this debate will continue, and it'll depend to some extent on where the balance comes out. What will also matter going forward enormously for climate will be technology. And in this context, basically collaborative leadership across the globe. China is a large country. It needs to be engaged. What role China plays collaboratively and the leadership it takes, the partnerships it builds, and the trust. Innovation and deployment of technology will matter enormously for the climate trajectory globally. And I submit that China is well positioned to help with that transition. Now, from the perspective of China, what matters? Now, we know that China, and Philippe had a slide on that, which showed that China is the largest and will remain the largest energy consuming country. Energy demand will continue to grow. It does have many characteristics of a developing country. I mean, Chinese citizens have aspirations. I mean, yes, air conditioning needs are going to increase. You can call them needs or wants, but most Chinese would be looking for a more, and uh, rationally so, a more comfortable lifestyle. So air conditioning demand, mobility demand, whether it becomes electric vehicles or otherwise, it's like two cars in your garage or a car in your garage. These things we can expect that as China develops, it is a developing country, these aspirations and these benchmarks will begin to matter. In terms of making trade-offs and priorities, what development priorities will matter? China has established itself, it set some very important targets on climate change, but there are issues and very significant issues in terms of GDP growth. Now, China had expected to meet the target of being a moderately well-off society by 2020. I mean, COVID has intervened. This year may not be as good as it was expected, but nevertheless, jobs will matter enormously. And then there is the whole issue of the just social transition from coal. I mean, China, I don't have to say much about it. You all know how much of coal they consume, how reliant their economies are, how reliant some of their provinces are. And the World Bank does a lot of work with some of the provinces on this particular issue. And we can say that much of the European Union and others are still struggling with the transition. The bank, as a matter of fact, continues to work on the issues of coal transition in countries such as Greece and Poland, which are arguably fairly developed countries or high-income countries. But this will be an existential question from a climate perspective going forward. Then there's the issue of the ecological civilization. It's a term that the Chinese use. It's used in a lot of Chinese policy documents. But what drives that are local domestic pollution considerations. Will gas play a role in the transition? How much will it play a role in the transition? These become important questions, and the issue of how fast they move on energy and climate will also be driven by how much a factor like domestic pollution, local pollution actually matters, and it matters enormously. And then finally, China is definitely, as Philippe has put it has many features of a superpower or a hybrid superpower. It is establishing itself as a leader in climate action. So over the next decade or so, where it stands in this leadership pantheon will matter, and how much it wants to act on this imperative will also matter. What I would also submit is energy security. Is it an increasing concern or not? I believe it will be an increasing concern. The world is going through a period of uncertainty. Politics comes into everything in a fairly significant way. In this country where some of us reside presently, in a couple of weeks, we'll be going through the motions of figuring out what the next step or transition would be. And from a perspective of China, they have questions. Can we trust? Can we rely on imported sources of energy? At what scale? Can we rely on importing gas from, let's say, the United States? The United States wants to export a lot of gas, but how much does China want to be reliant on those imports? Be it from Russia, be it from the US or other countries. Then there is this extremely important issue of access to technologies in the entire energy system chain. If you read the press, yes, there are lots of debates, lots of finger pointing, lots of allegations being thrown around about technology, security, etc. But this will also define how the world, and to some extent China, moves on climate action. Going over to my next and final slide. What I posit here is, yes, if we consider China as a developing country with the features of a hybrid superpower, I would say China has shown itself to be an entrepreneurial state, an innovative state. And going forward, some of the questions we need to delve into would be, are innovation and innovation policy important in meeting the challenges of climate change? And that, to some extent, will determine the engagement model with China and what role China plays. Then there are questions around, have we recognized the role of the state in driving innovation and investment? And these are important questions not only for China, but they will be important questions for the US, for the European Union, and a number of other countries. If we're all going to be successful in that, I think I would posit that I don't think we should get too hung up on whether it's all publicly or privately financed. There will be hybrid financing. Then the question is what China does in supporting and financing climate innovation, would it matter? And here I say it has. I mean, if we look back and we look at all the low-priced solar projects we're getting globally, I would submit that would not have been achieved without what China did in terms of the development. I would say a lot of the basic research perhaps took place in many universities around the world, as well as Chinese universities. But the dramatic cost reductions, the very fact that you can have people deliver 3.5 cents power in India or Dubai or Uzbekistan, to some extent depended and has depended a lot on what China did to drive down the price of these technologies. It will matter in the context of batteries. It is mattering in the context of low carbon mobility. I mean, in terms of urban mobility, the strides that China has made, and Philip refers to that in his report as well, in terms of high-speed rail, I mean, you can argue whether that is of a lower carbon footprint than other alternatives, and I would submit it has a lower carbon footprint. As a consequence, I posit that it should matter that what China does in this space will matter for climate. I mean, I call them super scale advantages. It has a huge market size. It has a long reach on research and development. They've got universities. They've got a very well-qualified workforce. They have shown the world what low-cost production competencies mean. I spoke about it in the context of solar PVs. They've got financial depth. And, I put it out there saying prospective policy cohesion. I mean, these are the various trade-offs and how you bring a cohesive policy framework around it. I mean, this is a known unknown at this point, and I'm sure the Chinese are thinking deeply about these questions. Now, in terms of risks to collective global climate action, I believe there are significant risks. I mean, what we're seeing today, and it is emerging post-COVID, I shouldn't say post-COVID, it's emerging or it's coming into starker reality with some of the discontinuities we are seeing with COVID. We see that in some of the finger pointing that's going around. Would this lead to a breakdown in global supply chains and technological interconnectedness if certain products which are important for climate action do not get the necessary technological connections with be it EU suppliers or US suppliers, and then we have a bifurcation of supply chains? I don't think that will work well for climate. And then finally, I would leave you with the thought that, public policies do matter. And, does it matter in terms of who finances it? Yes. The EU has issues on what they call the influence of the state or the state funding, state aid as it's called. Yes, I mean, China has a lot of, if you want to call it that, state aid. Now, the question is that good or bad for climate action? Does it lead to good outcomes, or can it support good outcomes? And I think it's important in this context to recognize, as I said earlier, it may not matter. It does matter at some narrow sectoral or subsectoral level, but in the broader context of climate action, I would suggest that, we need all actors involved. We cannot distort markets, but we must recognize the role of the state. I mean, the US put men on the moon, not because it was privately funded, but because much of the research took place in universities, and the outcomes of that, we see the outcomes of that in many industries. I mean, if you look at the technology that goes into iPods, iPads, etc., much of it has been publicly supported research that has led to that. So I would submit that the climate challenge would require a mixed set of financing. And I think China, as a hybrid superpower, it's a developing country, is well positioned to help us in that challenge. So let me stop there. Thank you, Philippe and colleagues, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, Ranjit. Thank you very much. And obviously, there's clearly a lot going on in terms of the bank's thinking with its borrower, China, that still remains a borrower. I was very much struck by a lot of your points about the role of the state. And you talked about China, you talked about the European Union. Actually, my colleagues just published a report called Energizing America that talks about the potential positive role of the US government in promoting low climate innovation. Having said that, let us now turn to Sarah to get your perspective, Sarah.
Okay, can everybody see a slide presentation? That is hopefully in presentation mode.
Yes,
Okay,
you
great.
are.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Philip, for inviting me to be on the panel today. I'm always glad when our scholar lunches can spawn interesting research questions that that our affiliates can go and look at in their day jobs. So very pleased to see that that happened here. I will basically start, I think, similarly to how Ranjit started, which is what's the point of this question, right? What's the significance of this question? And by and large, my conclusion is that it's an important question because it matters for how we treat China. And so I think Philip did the smart thing, which is he picked an all of the above solution in his hybrid model in his paper from the summer, which is, you know, probably the most accurate description of China because China is many things. But I'm going to talk about it from a bit of a broader perspective, which is how the world conceives of China and China's role in some of our climate challenges and why it matters to think about them as a developed country and whether or not a superpower, I'll get to in the end some of the considerations around that. So I apologize, I put these slides together without any assistance and overnight. So if they're not super fancy, you please blame me. So to the question of why does this matter, you know, we treat developed and developing countries differently, right? And particularly in the context of climate discussions, the centrality of whether you were termed a developed versus a developing country mattered a great deal. And I would say the turning point here has fundamentally been when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, when, you know, China, by virtue of what they aspire to be, crossed the threshold over into developed country context and took on commitments, and really in so doing helped to sort of reshape the framework around bottom-up commitments to action on climate change and leadership in an entirely different context. So, but we treat developed and developing countries differently. We think about developing countries as acquiring more latitude in terms of what we expect of them in terms of climate context in their commitments, and we think about providing them more assistance. So really China, you know, in terms of, you know, additional and greater latitude for how quickly they act to deal with climate change, it seems like we aren't doing that as much with China anymore. We have higher expectations for them than we would for other developing countries. And in terms of assistance, there's also sort of an increasing sort of reticence to provide China with additional assistance for being able to make this transition. This is because one of the other differentiating factors between developed and developing countries is that we expect them to have different capabilities. And China, for a number of reasons, has shown itself to be a country of immense capability, not without challenges, as Ranjit described quite accurately, which there's even more of them if you look across the political and security spectrum. But certainly China is a country of enormous capability. Traditionally developed and developing countries have different relationships with one another, and they operate in different spheres. And this is another area where I would say the traditional sort of developed country, developing country construct that we have seen in global climate negotiations and the way that we think about partnerships, China has really sort of broken away from the developing country bloc and is really sort of considered an entity unto itself. In fact, if you wanted to classify China as a superpower in any way, shape, or form, which I'll talk about a little bit later, it's really because of, you know, the fact that the United States and China, and if you want to include Europe as well, certainly constitute the leadership of global action that is required. And therefore, it doesn't really exist in some other ledger. It exists in sort of that top tier ledger of actors that, one, from a political perspective, and quite frankly, just from a numbers perspective, need to take action in order to deal with climate. And then finally, you know, economic and geopolitical dynamics are oftentimes skewed between developed and developing countries. And this is something that is maybe a little bit more of a nuanced comment, but if you think about all the ways in which China is now involved in discussions about not just global commons issues or global issues where it is an agenda setter, but does it abide by the rules? It is traditionally, it is even more being thought of as maybe the way that large and powerful developed countries are considered, which is they can set rules sometimes, they can set the global agenda, they don't always sort of abide by it either. So in a number of ways, I think, you know, at least in my mind, the turning point for China being considered a developed country and potentially a sort of a superpower country or a hybrid superpower country was fundamentally the Paris Climate Agreement. It was the point where the political aspirations and the political construct that we thought about in terms of dealing with China really flipped definitively from being one kind of entity, more identified with developing country and allowances, and thinking about, not having to do as much or doing what was in sort of the basket of your capabilities, to being a country that we had much higher expectations for. And this is just to outline all of the ways in which China has capacity, and China has really important capacity. It's a big consumer, it's a big manufacturer, it's a big emitter. This is just showing the share of China's electric vehicle car stock, but also to say, China's the largest energy consumer. It's the largest consumer across of a number of different types of energy energy resources. It makes up over half of the global coal consumption. We published a paper almost 10 years ago called China, a Leader or a Laggard in a Clean Energy Future? And the answer is they're both. They're huge in just about everything because of their size, the sort of scale, talent that Ranjit talked about earlier. They're the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, as Philip said, and largest manufacturer of solar PV. If you also look at their positioning in future issues of rare earth mining, they are strategically positioned to be able to play a very large role in the global supply chain of critical technologies, including earth mining production, that are going to be really critically important for thinking about not just their transition to a clean energy economy, but the global transition to a clean energy economy. In addition, this is just another sort of graphic of the competitiveness indicators that the World Economic Forum put together, thinking about China as an innovation economy. I think one of the things that is interesting that Ranjit sort of brought up is the ability that China has had to think strategically about its role in this transition and to really bring the resources of its economy and its political system to bear in being prepared and pursuing a low carbon future. It is not just about their manufacturing capability, although that has been a very big part of their ability to play and build this role that they have in global supply chains. But it's also about their longer term aspirations to be part of the innovation cycle, to be competitive in a clean energy future. This is important, and I'm going to sort of transition in a moment to the broader context in which we regard China. China is not only in our humble little climate world recognized as being an increasing economic and technological competitor to the US, but it is thought of across the board as being a potential competitor. And this is, in addition, starting to frame the way that the United States and other countries view China on the global stage. And it further solidifies the way that we think about them in terms of being a competitor in a developed country and a superpower as compared to something from a more developmental perspective. So one of the things that's really important is how the US and China sort of how we think about China and how we gauge our expectations. This is another area where I think it's quite clear to see that on the US side, we've had nearly 40 years of engagement, and it's really fundamentally transformed. It's gone from a period where we were really thinking about a normalization of troubled relations to thinking about being able to incorporate China into a globalized system. And that was probably the height of the developing country context in which we considered our relationship with China. And then over the last couple of decades, it's really transitioned to be more about thinking about ways in which we have a strategic competition. And so this frame of China as a strategic competitor to the world's largest sort of superpower is really one of the dynamics that makes it really hard to conceive of China in many of the ways that it's important, political, economic, security, militarily, to think about China as a developing country anymore. They may still, by virtue of their development status, be a developing country, but the way that they're playing on the world stage, the way that they are identified as a major strategic competitor for the United States across a wide range of issues is going to be increasingly important for how they're treated in many, many different contexts, climate among them. So there's sort of this gravitational pull middle of all these other major strategic issues, where China is really considered not only a developed country, but one of the most powerful countries that the US has to contend with. And that's going to necessitate thinking about them in a different frame. And it's going to mean that we have to think about, it's going to necessitate thinking about what our expectations are for them going forward. CSIS just put out a big survey on China power and how the US policymakers and public think about mapping the future of US China policy. There's just some interesting insights here to really sort of solidify what I said before. This idea of the US being in a strategic competition with China and how climate fits into that. It says overall 54% of the US public names China as the country's is posing the country greatest challenge to the United States, with Russia, far behind. Among national security experts, 79% think the United States would prevail in a conflict with China in the Western Pacific today, but just 54% think that would be true going forward. This is, there's a lot in this study, but I pulled that point out to say there's a lot of, just as China is projecting where it would like to be economically down the road and positioning its climate strategy, its climate policy, its economic policy, its innovation policy to that, aspiring role, the US strategic community is thinking about the growth of China as well and thinking, geez, like, we need to think about how we're acting vis-a-vis China now, because the advantages that they could be facing in about 10 years put us at even more of a strategic disadvantage. And so again, that sort of reinforces this frame, this view of China as not only being as powerful as they are today, but as powerful as they may be down the line. Again, a strong majority of national security and business experts favor banning Huawei from the US 5G market. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is a significant issue and how we should think about that, what impact things like that could have on global clean energy supply chains. Because while this idea of banning Huawei from the 5G market is getting a lot of play, there are other national security provisions that the US has been putting in place in the electric bulk power system to keep remote Chinese technology or remote accessible Chinese technology out of the US electric power system, which is could have some potentially interesting implications. But one interesting thing is the national security community thinks that climate change is the most important area to seek cooperation with China. So even in the context of all of this sort of suspicion and hostility, I will also say, by the way, I didn't put it in here, but many of the people that were polled for this study also sort of emphasize the importance of working with allies in sort of balancing in dealing with some of the issues that may be constraining for the United States and China to work together. Climate change was one of them as well. But looking at to climate change as a potential area of opportunity for the two superpowers to be in that context, to be working together. So I wanted to talk about what the potential implications here are. And sometimes when I have an uncertain future, I just like to make scenarios. And so if you think about how people are thinking about the future of China and the US and our relationship. And I think it's really particularly important in the context of climate change, because envisioning a world where you have either the Chinese or the US sort of sitting out of doing something productive on climate is not a very productive dynamic for the global climate change effort. And in fact, though, when you're looking at the future of US-China relations, there's some fairly sort of draconian scenarios that can come out of that. The first one is this idea of sort of a devolution of the relationship into decoupling and containment. When you think about the success that has been achieved in global climate change in terms of deploying low-cost clean energy technologies around the world, one of the true success stories has been countries that put policies in place to have clean energy technology deployed, like feed-in tariffs or mandates or other incentives for things like solar PV and wind and other things. And then countries like China being able to develop manufacturing technologies at scale and be able to sell those things around the world. I would say the vast majority of our thinking as a community about how you actually tackle the issues of climate change is predicated on this idea of these global supply chains for moving technology around the world and driving the costs down. If you had a decoupling of the US-China relationship because of this somewhat confrontational nature of the strategic competition dynamic that we're seeing today, a lot of that would break down. A lot of that would be really would be hampered by increased tariffs and trade wars and sort of a regionalization of supply chains or a sort of a choosing of markets, if you will. quite so. I don't say that's a likely outcome, but I think it's one that we should all be thinking about when we think about how the U.S. and China engage on a range of important strategic initiatives, including climate change. Another potential outcome is that this tension between the U.S. and China could just all go away, as could the sort of tension between sort of globalized supply chains and sort of localized industrial strategy and trade policy. You could just sort of see a period of re-engagement, right? But this is a particularly interesting outcome when people think about, a change in administration, the potential for a Biden administration. But it's really hard to actually think about how the U.S. and China could revert back to where we were maybe, say 5, 6, 7 years ago, given everything that we have as sort of legitimate concerns about each other's activity and conduct on the global stage, and this atmosphere of competition. So one of the best outcomes here could be, thinking about coexistence and competition. How do the U.S. and China find ways to work together on issues like climate change where we have a mutual interest, but also figure out ways that we can be competitors in that space, recognizing the idea that, yes, this may be a strategic competition, but it should be, as a report that we put out recently, it should be a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And I think the question is, how do we construct that kind of dynamic without being Pollyanna-ish about the real national security and strategic issues that the two nations face, and that will probably color the relationship for some time. And the reason I'll just leave this on this note is the reason why this is critically important is actually, this is just an image from University of Maryland put together on China's recent pledge to be net zero carbon by 2060. And if you just look at the levers that they're going to have to pull to be able to accomplish that objective, they are fundamentally not different than what every other country on the world has to do, including the United States. So regardless of the differences, regardless of the difference in position, we all have similar challenges that we're going to have to face. And so, we should just sort of make our peace with where China is in the global stage at this moment and think about how to use their capabilities for good and cooperation to be able to achieve those objectives. I'm gonna stop there.
Great, thanks a lot, Sarah. Hopefully we can figure out a way to engage in a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. Words do matter. I was very much struck by your repeated use of the term major strategic competitor as maybe an alternative to are they yet a superpower or not. Having said that, I'd like to turn now over to Shang-Jin for your thoughts.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So I thank you, Philip, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm taking on Philip's challenge, and so I'm going to ask the following question. China as a developing country, does it have a developed country's aspiration in terms of energy and climate change? Is China a developing and developed country? Because the only sensible definition of a developing and developed countries by the wisdom of World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, and all international organizations is income level. In terms of income level, of course, China, in spite of many years of high growth, is not a high income country. So Chinese, after decades and decades of a very rapid growth, Chinese income level roughly is that of Brazil, about $10,000. And what does $10,000 means? Someone in the US earning minimum wage, in fact, will have more than $10,000 in a year. That means average Chinese has an annual income less than someone in the US earning minimum wage. So therefore, it's far from being a high income country. What does it matter in climate change context? Sarah mentioned about the world climate regime imposes asymmetric obligations on high-income countries and non-high-income countries, and that's because the problem with climate change is we have this greenhouse gas emission that's essentially posing a threat to the survival of a human race. And greenhouse gas emission has a very long half-life. That is, it's the stock of greenhouse gas emission. Flow every year's addition clearly matters. But the stock is the thing that poses the threat. And the stock of the greenhouse gas emission mostly comes historical accumulation of those. So that means that all countries that have been industrializing have been contributing to this greenhouse gas stock, and those that have a longer history of those contribute to this more on a per capita basis. So Europeans collectively, American collectively on a per capita basis have contributing far more to the stock of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere than the Indians, Chinese, and Brazils. Therefore, from an equity point of view, I'm just explaining the logic behind why the world think that there will be asymmetric obligation imposed on this. So one of my colleagues who was advising U.S. government on climate negotiation said, he privately said, the Chinese view the great obligation on them is like in terms of industrialization. Every country that has been industrializing, contributing this, the Chinese show up for dessert, but they have been asked to pay for the entire bill of the dinner. Nonetheless, of course, what sets China apart is its size, and of course, its long years of economic growth, and they also should matter, as Sarah was pointing out. If you look at the individual countries' contribution to global growth, average over 5-year periods, starting from about year 2000 and onwards, China has been the world's biggest single country contributor to global GDP growth, followed by US. US has been the biggest single country contributor for the previous 100 and some years, but China has overtaken US in the last 20 years. We are in the COVID year. COVID, of course, has knocked down Chinese growth rate and all countries' growth rates. As IMF and World Bank affirmed that this year, every single G20 country is expected to grow negatively, and every single country, with one exception, here is China. So if one were to look at individual country contribution to global growth this year, Chinese contribution will be more than 100%, because other large countries will have subtracting from the global growth, and that therefore raise the question: could China do more than what its income level suggests? Can China be more ambitious on energy and climate? China is in the midst of composing its 14th five-year plan, and in all likelihood, the 14th five-year plan will feature more environmentally friendly growth model. And China's successive industrial policy since about 2006 also onwards have embedded environmental goals beyond GDP growth. The implementation is far from being perfect. There are many deviations. When it actually comes to delivering this, officials, especially local governments, will find it costly to implement some of those. So they regress on many of those things. But the ambitions there, and ambitions have become progressively bigger, and in terms of implementation, is also getting more stringent over time. China's so-called national, what is called the national intended national determined goal under the Paris Agreement was to lower CO2 intensity per unit of GDP over time, and making sure the peak comes before 2030. And data seems to see China's, my colleagues who are more expert in those issues can correct me. I think the data is more or less in line with that trajectory, mostly because not so much means there's part of government action, but there's a tremendous structural change in the economy. The economy becomes more consumption-based, more service-based. That per se means that the CO2 content or CO2 intensity of the GDP generation process becomes lower. President Xi Jinping at the recent UN General Assembly announced a goal for the country to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So that they went beyond goes beyond China's Paris commitment that, in principle, if delivered, can be a major boost for the global efforts to keep global warming, increase in global warming, to be less than 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial level. And that to achieve this, they will involve dramatic changes in the use of energy away from coal, the current dominant source of energy. About half of the Chinese energy sources is coal-based, but to be carbon neutral, China needs to get dramatically away from dependence on coal, and substantially more usage of renewables, nuclear, and so on, and potentially, to the extent China cannot get completely away from fossil fuel-based energy, they will also involve more deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. How would that be achieved? Here's a table that I've stolen from Tsinghua University's Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economics. This is someone's scenario analysis about how, what does it take, what might it take for China to become carbon neutral by 2016. So it involves very dramatic reduction in dependence on coal as an energy source from 2.86 billion to 110 million by 2060, 96% decline, coupled with dramatically more usage of renewables, solar in particular, nuclear, wind, and so on. So it's not easy feat. There's no guarantee that China will be able to do that. But here's one scenario in which this might be accepted. So could China do this? I mean, this now we talk about how can we understand what will come in the future? That's a very hard thing to do. I recall when I was serving at the Asian Development Bank, I talked to my colleague who was making loans to various member countries, and I have similar conversation with my friends in World Bank. They mentioned the following facts. Each year so there will be cycles of negotiation between development banks and member states about what programs they will fund. I think Ranjit does this regularly. That country will say we want to do following project in following sectors, and the World Bank or ADB staff will say this is good, this is not good, and they will form a plan. And then the development bank staff often have a private assessment of whether a given country can deliver, can carry this, and they do some internal rating, which is super confidential. You don't want to offend member countries. And I asked, so I asked some of my colleagues, what are there like irregularities? Are there things that you can say country A, B, C are very likely to be able to deliver what they say, and country E, F, G have a very high chance to not be able to carry out their commitment? And one thing I learned is they say, well, that experience suggests that China in the last few years often have been able to carry out what they promised to do, that they have a high implementation capacities. And I visited many bank projects in China, India, and Bangladesh, many member countries, and I often have this conversation with people on the ground, and that it seems to broadly agree that compared to other developing country members of the international banks, China seems to have relatively strong implementation capacity and more or less can be counted on doing what they agree to do. So that's good. That's good news. That provides some hope that perhaps that compared to other countries, that what China wants to do, has committed to do, might have a decent chance compared to other countries to carry out, and that will be good news for the world as well. Beyond those, this carbon neutral ambition, I think there are other stuff that potentially China can contribute to the world, and we don't hear enough, or we don't see enough, I guess, discussion of this. One is the China's experimentation with tradable carbon emissions that China have experimented in multiple cities since 2014, I believe. It has been keep saying that you want to nationalize the whole national, meaning implement the program on national scale, and have been postponing this a few times. Nonetheless, there have been, I think there are lessons learned from this. Different cities have tried different versions of the carbon emission tradable permits, which essentially is a cap is a program that all economists think is perhaps the most efficient, at least socially costly way to cap emissions. I think more can be done, and I would love to see international development communities and World Bank, ADB in particular, to encourage China to do more of those and to extract lessons and see this can be applied to other countries or not. The other is in fossil fuel and carbon capture. And here I want to mention one particular technology. I think that also is hopeful is meaningful for the world community to discuss. In order to achieve carbon neutral, just focusing on getting away from fossil fuel as a source of energy may be desirable, but it's not very practical. So many countries, India included, said many times they don't want to do this. But what the IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle technology, does is to use fossil fuel technology, but then use it to produce. I'm going to skip engineering discussion about how that works. But the idea is that the process of using IGCC to turn fossil fuel into energy is one that the end process is virtually pollution free. And I have visited some IGCC plants. In the process, it doesn't automatically give you carbon capture and sequestration, but it greatly facilitates carbon capture and sequestration. And it can be used to retrofit existing fossil fuel-based power plants. I think it has a lot of potential. It's a practical matter. I think it should be considered together with a global move to depend more on renewable energy. IGCC has not been widely used yet because we have not quite solved. The world community has not quite solved some of the technical problems. It involves a lot of capital cost, but you also there's some technical features that makes the system is not working out very well yet. Existing IGCC plants often involves a lot of gasified downtime, reducing the efficiency and increasing the cost. That makes it harder reduce the willingness for many countries to adopt it. And then of course, ironically, there's also a bit of policy barrier. If I were still working at ADB, I couldn't say this because many of the shareholding country of the development banks don't want have decided that they want to compel development banks not to support any fossil fuel energy, which ironically makes technology like this, some technology that uses fossil fuel, but the end process can involve nearly zero carbon emission, not fundable. I think we also need to perhaps do more to do a more policy experiment. What's the role of China in this? Let me skip this, right? So I thought I had one more slide. Wait, okay, maybe I just stay with this. So China has one IGCC power plant in Tianjin, which I visited. Clearly has, like all other IGCC plants, has not quite solved the problem of the technical things, but it has been improving. So that over time they figure out a way to reduce downtime, prolong the period in which it is functioning well, and those experimentation, I think, will contribute to the evolvement, perfection of the technology. And I think to the extent this is something that those experiments generates externalities, positive spillover to all countries. In a way, there's a case to be made that one should, global society should subsidize those kind of experimentation. China should also, to the extent this is also good for China, China should also subsidize experimentation in those technology. The IGCC plant in Tianjin could do carbon capture, and they do small amount of carbon capture. They did not do 100% of this because the carbon capture and sequestration technology is also expensive. But global development banks, I would advocate, is not putting enough in promoting the experimentation with this, in working out a plan to make sure technologies like this is on a fast cost declining path, so that by 2030, by 2035, the world will be in a state where many more technologies like this can be put into place, so that this will, I think this will complement this renewable energy effort and make it in practical terms, make it more likely for many developing countries, India and others, to adopt those technologies. So one reason why China is willing to do this is, this is kind of in line with what Sarah said. Why China is a developing country, it has ambition to do more than what its income would suggest. So for example, in terms of China's overall investment in research and development as a share of GDP, globally, high income countries do more R&D. As China gets richer, China does more R&D. But relative to other countries, a comparable income level, China is already doing more R&D per unit of GDP than other countries. That to the extent investment in IGCC, investment in renewable technology, also has this technical innovation component in line with China's ambition. So to summarize, China is a developing country by income level, but has an ambition to go beyond what its income level normally would suggest in terms of science and technology. Importantly, and hopefully for the world to also have ambition in energy and climate change more than what income level will stay. And Chinese experience and Chinese financing in tradable permits, in IGCC, in other areas, beyond China's own reduction in emission, can also generate useful, positive spillover to other countries' effort in more climate-friendly transition towards different energy pattern and different climate change management. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Shang-Jin. Very, very interesting. A lot of this reminds me of sort of a variation on the parable of the blindfolded people had never seen an elephant, and they were describing the elephant, and they touched different parts of the elephant, and they described it differently. I think in this case, we have an elephant that's running full speed down the road, and people are trying to describe it. So why don't we move now to our moderated session in Q&A, and we have a variety of questions that have come up that touch on some of the points that you've all made, including about coal. But again, before we get into that, just a few things I have to say administratively, which is, again, I'd like to thank you all for watching online. My name is Philip Benoit, and I'm here with Sarah Ladislaw, Senior Vice President and Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Ranjit Lamech, who's the Regional Director, Infrastructure, East Asia and Pacific Region at the World Bank, and Shang-Jin Wei, and T. Wang, Professor of Chinese Business and Economy at Columbia Business School, and former Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank. We are discussing whether China is a developing country or a superpower and what that means, particularly for energy and climate. We will now move into a moderated discussion. We will open up to questions from the audience in a bit. Actually, I already have some from those who have submitted them. Thank you for those. And for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can also submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive, CGEP Live, and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. So to get things rolling, I'd like to ask really the following opening question, and we touched upon it, some of you have touched upon the issue of COVID. Obviously in today's context, it's difficult to talk about economics and other things without really touching upon COVID. So my kickoff question for the panel is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected China, as well as this issue that we're discussing today? Why don't we start with Ranjit, and we'll see whether Sarah can join back in, because I think we've lost her.
Thanks, Philippe. COVID and some of the events happening around it seems to have exacerbated, and people will argue in many ways, it has exacerbated a sense of mistrust as well as a sense of decoupling. And I think COVID will at some point, yes, we will bring it under control globally. We are going to lose perhaps at least a year of growth in many economies. It'll take a while for it to all pick up. During this phase, there will probably be an effort, I won't say an effort, but countries are going to definitely gravitate more to, and as they should, social mitigation, protection of jobs, etc., which will perhaps slow down some progress towards important climate change goals. So, there would be other variables that would suffer. So, maybe the pace at which we can adopt certain standards. So some of that will suffer. It'll probably take a few years to emerge from that. I think we will emerge stronger in many ways, but I think COVID is contributing to an increased sense of mistrust. It could lead to decoupling, which I have indicated would be not good from a climate perspective. And I think it might just slow down the urge to change standards, etc., which would be in the benefit of climate and other variables that we're talking about today. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Shang-Jin.
COVID is not only a public health crisis globally, but it's also a source of economic recession that we see. The lockdown of the economy clearly directly hits many households' income, and that which in turn means lower demand for goods produced at home and goods produced everywhere. So it's a source of a global economic recession as well. In terms of connection with China, because China has managed to get out of COVID ahead of many other major economies, and as of now, it seems like there has not been a serious second wave, third wave yet. Therefore, World Bank, ADB, IMF, and all investment banks are predicting China to have a positive growth rate this year, much lower than otherwise would be the case, but positive nonetheless. That provides a source of demand for products in other countries. It also provides a source of a supply in PPE and elsewhere to other countries' supply chain. So that's sort of a big picture in terms of effect of COVID. In terms of connection with energy and climate, I see two connections. One is I imagine in the effort of reopening the economy, getting GDP to be back on track, getting household income to be back on track, perhaps some of the local governments will be more relaxed in enforcing some of the environment or pollution control kind of measures. So there might be a negative on this, at least temporary. On the other hand, China has been transitioning towards more a service-based economy, digital economy dependent kind of a growth, and COVID has reinforced the momentum. And those digital economy-based growth, service-based growth, requires much less energy usage, and that per se is good for the environment. So there's these two effects, I think, are coming from the COVID shock.
Great, thanks for that. Sarah seems to have lost her internet connection, so we're hoping she'll join back in. So in her place, let me just maybe add as a third commentary. I think what was interesting that I've sort of seen in terms of COVID is, on the one hand, if you had looked at projections in terms of income growth, income per capita growth, China was expected to graduate out of middle income status in about 3 or 4 years. Clearly, this year is going to be a slower year from GDP growth perspective, so that will retard it, slow it down. But I think what's also interesting to see, coming back to a point you had made, Shang-Jin, is that there was an effort clearly by China towards the spring to try to position itself as really the supplier of needed medical equipment, PPE equipment and the like, including by shipping a lot of stuff to Europe. And that really actually engendered a very uneven, I think, result. So on the one hand, initially there was some positive noise coming out of Europe, but that quickly turned into frustration in Europe and concerns about the quality of the equipment and the like. So as opposed to that providing an opportunity for China to clearly establish itself as a supplier to the world of needed equipment, in fact, I think we saw really a very mixed, uneven sort of outcome. So clearly,
if I could add a comment on the last point, Philip. So PPE is a low-tech product. Most of the PPE products are low-tech product. When we saw a sharp increase in the global demand for PPE, most of the supplies, many of the supplies from China and elsewhere are small-time, relatively small firms with very uneven quality standard. And many of the PPE suppliers were not previous PPE producers. So therefore, they also, I know in fact, an entrepreneur who used to produce, I think, a bathroom products, but given the very rapid increase in demand, he switched to this. So I mean, he happened to be a good scientist. I don't know how good his PPE products are, but I know he whatever he does, he does kind of his own research. Nonetheless, I think that I won't be surprised that there will be a decline in average quality, and there will be many of the supplies are low quality. But this is actually a common challenge in international trade. That it's normally very hard to ascertain the quality of the supplies, especially when you have a surge in demand, especially when you have regional governments, not just national governments in Europe and elsewhere, who didn't used to be in the business of buying stuff from foreign country, now in the procurement business. But there are many things one can do that we have not done enough. So, for example, Alibaba, the top intermediary platform for short-term supply. When I talk to them, they say, yeah, of course, there's a very a relatively low-cost solution to that, which is that Alibaba can and platforms like this can do quality inspection at much lower cost than a regional government in Italy or regional government in other countries can do. And yet we don't think creatively about sort of using those quality certification mechanism. I think that is important. That should have been done, but we have not done that very much. One, two, look at the data. So the statement that I think that the concern about quality of a PPE from China means that after the initial wave, you're going to see a turning away from Chinese supply PPE. Their statement is not supported by data. Data actually suggests, if you look at monthly or weekly export data, PPE exports from out of China to other countries continue to be increasing at extremely rapid rates. It must mean there are a lot of continue to be a lot of demand for PPE. They just don't show up in the media. I think the media reports don't. I mean, they tend to focus on certain storylines, but the data does not support the idea that you see no one wants to buy PPE from China. Probably the second part of it, people now you can tap into those quality certification services that they can get better supply from more reliable suppliers. That's my guess.
Yeah,
Sarah,
Sarah's coming back. So she comes back in because it's great. She'll be here for the next question. But just to respond to what you're saying, Shang-Jin, all of that may be correct, but the fact of the matter is, in some ways also, as you're thinking about moving from developing to advanced economy, movement towards a superpower or market strategic competitor, there is a gloss that goes with that. And the question is, are you able to sort of generate that positive gloss? Japan is a center of technology. Advanced economy is a center of technology. The PPE story on China, understand it's low tech, did not help in terms of that glass, irrespective of the data. And this, I think, dovetails well into the next question I wanted to ask, which a lot of people sort of raised, which is the issues and the concerns around what China is doing, not so much within China, but in terms of investments outside of China. And in particular, a concern that China is promoting and supporting coal investments in other countries under its Belt and Road initiative. So maybe we had started the last one with Ranjit. Sarah, do you mind? Why don't we start with you if you're back on?
I hope so. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you okay.
Okay, so
Welcome back.
we're living in COVID times. We had a construction truck has torn down all of the Verizon connections in our neighborhood. So I am on my phone. So hopefully this works out okay. If I drop out again, I apologize. It's a great question. I would think about it. There's a number of different considerations here. One, and I'm sorry I didn't hear the previous answer, but picking up on this concept of positive versus negative glass, I think it's really important for us also not to be like super hypocritical about judging China's behavior, because the U.S. has a lot of ways in which we too are very complicated in the fact that we do sort of positive and negative things depending on our own political economy. And in the context of BRI, I think you have to think about BRI for what it is, which was sort of a loosely held umbrella for a bunch of things that were going on in China, which were designed to steer investment outside the country, to absorb overcapacity in a bunch of different industries in China. And it was sort of, given this sort of overarching strategic significance. Yes, it is true that a lot of the investments that were made by China in some of these other BRI countries were in coal-fired power generation, but a couple of different things. We did some analysis of this along with our team that focuses on BRI at CSIS. And, the truth of the matter is a lot of the recipient countries, that's what they felt comfortable with, right? So it wasn't essentially China, shoving coal-fired power plants down the throats of countries that didn't want them. It was really just a dynamic in which, China was willing to make investments in the types of technologies that certain countries wanted. And so I think when you think about remedying those situations, it's both about upping the standards within China for what they will invest in the context of BRI countries or external investment as a whole. And then two, also raising the standards of the recipient countries so that they don't, sort of require or ask for those types of technologies if there are better options, or we can find ways of making better options possible. And I would say the last thing is China's not the only country that was doing it, right? Japan has been doing the same thing. And so we need to be a bit even-handed about how we think about judging Chinese investment overseas. That being said, going forward, I think if China is going to continue to make investment in clean energy technology or in energy technologies outside of China, it behooves everybody to figure out how to pull the levers that make it possible for clean energy to be the technology that sort of win in the calculation of where those investments go in the future.
Thanks. Let me turn to you, Ranjit, next, and then Shang-Jin, turn to you, because I noted that you talked very much about the IGCC efficient coal option. So Ranjit, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to just build on what Sarah has just said. I think let's not get too judgmental about this. And what I mean by that, yes, China has done a lot of coal-based investments as part of its BRI investments. And as Sarah said, many countries wanted those investments. And if you say, I think the world is moving to a place where we're going to have less and less of these coal-based investments. GE has just pulled out of coal. They've said they're not going to build any more coal plants, but that was just 2 months ago. Japan still goes out and provides coal generation technology to others. It's just that they're not as competitive as China in terms of prices. Korea would like to supply those same technologies, once again, not as competitive in terms of prices. China has provided coal plants to others as part of its BRI initiative. But if there had to be a counterpoint, then would other countries come in and provide those same countries renewable technologies at lower prices? As we say, the climate transition requires trillions and trillions of dollars, but nobody really is stepping up to provide that. So from where I sit at the bank, I do see that, yes, resources will be needed to help countries make that clean energy transition. Then, the other thing is, as Sarah said, let's not get too hypocritical about it. And I did see some questions on that. We have a number of large coal exporters. China is not a coal exporter. It imports a marginal amount of coal. But you have countries, and let's say the two largest coal exporters in the world are Australia and Indonesia. Both happen to be in the East Asia and Pacific region. And, if you treat coal as a drug, then we do have two very large drug pushers in the East Asia region, Australia and Indonesia. Now, how are we going to deal with these? So once again, collective global action on technologies, as well as incentives on what you actually absorb and do matter. Now, if the incentives are such that people would not want to rely on coal, yes, the Australians are going to export less coal, and maybe that's the direction the world needs to move in. It's not the fact that somebody provides somebody a coal plant that is going to, yes, they will continue in using coal. But we need to have incentives that will move away from countries having an incentive to export coal to meet these needs. So yes, carbon prices, etc., will begin to matter, as will other technologies. So I do expect that China will move into a phase. Yes, they do a lot of hydro elsewhere. They're doing a lot of clean energy exports in terms of solar PV. I certainly hope that the world will move in that direction, and we don't necessarily focus on, yes, coal plants are being built elsewhere, but we need to stop that coal development. And then the whole question is, there's a whole other question on gas. I mean, there are countries like the US who benefit from another fossil fuel that is gas. Now, does gas fit in with the transition? Should a country like the US begin to continue exporting gas? So I think we need to take a much wider view of it than just sort of saying, oh, China exports some coal plants. Yes, they do, as part of their BRI initiative. But then I like Sarah's perspective. Let's not get too hypocritical. Let's take a little wider view of the issues we face. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Before I turn to Shang-Jin, I mean, I'm finding myself in a strange position. Again, we've lost Sarah, but I think this time she probably won't have a chance to come in. Understand all the points, but also the fact of the matter is when you look at emissions, can we really afford to have China and other countries supporting and exporting coal projects? Just
so,
right. So Shang-Jin, your thoughts?
So China's financing of other countries' coal and other fossil fuel power plants is responding to those countries' demand, as my colleagues have said. So what can the world community to do? Well, I mean, the answer is that we need to alter the global price of using the coal and other fossil fuels relative to alternative energy. We are not doing that, but how can we do that? There are actually a couple of things one can do. Let me raise 3 ideas. One, why not use tariff as a tool for more productive use? I'm not a fan of tariff war, and I don't think the current administration's tariff war is productive. It's good for U.S. global trading system and other countries. However, we can think about one potentially productive use of tariff, which is to make any products made in using less desirable energy source more productive on world market. So they will involve a discussion at World Trade Organization that member countries will be authorized to impose tariff. So Sarah, I'm making an argument supporting one particular use of tariff, not general use of tariff. But we should have, WTO can agree if the world put enough weight on climate change issue, on clean energy issues, that we can authorize member countries to actually impose tariff on products using using dirty coals or using even someday maybe fossil fuels production techniques without using carbon captures. That's something we can do, and they will help to close the gap between the narrow production cost to the users and the cost to the global community, and they will alter the demand for countries in thinking about, should I use coal-based power plant or not? Something that potentially we can do. Somewhat radical, but I think is one productive usage of tariff. The other is that World Bank, ADB, IMF, in our loans to country, we almost always have conditionalities. We impose reform conditions. If the world community is serious enough about climate change challenge, we can make this to be a part of the conditionalities, that to receive financial assistance from international financial institutions, countries have to commit to more ambitious climate actions, have to commit to impose domestic taxes on fossil fuel-based kind of production techniques, again, to close the gap between narrow financial costs to using those technologies and the cost to the global community, cost to the society. And the third thing is, we need the U.S. to get back to global actions, rejoining Paris Agreement and up the ambition of a global actions. I think the combination of those will go a long way to reduce any country's demand for coal-based power plants and any other sort of non-climate friendly kind of production techniques. Eventually, we need to move their way to really making sure the world can achieve the goal that that climate change will not get out of hand before it's getting too late.
Right. No, so let me piggyback off the last thing you said, which is coming back to the Paris Agreement. But let me just say as a warning to our speakers, we're going to need to close up, and I'm going to come back around to each of you for 1 minute sort of quick concluding comments from each of you. But as you just pointed out, Shang-Jin, and it was raised in what you said earlier, Sarah, I mean, we see the importance of the Paris Agreement. When we look at coal, this issue we talked about BRI, I must admit I'm a little surprised by the fact that you all seem to agree as much as you did, but I think clearly when you look at it from an emissions perspective, we really can't afford to be emitting as much from the coal power plants that we are. And even when you think about Xi's announcement about achieving carbon neutrality before 2060 and peaking before 2030, there's a lot of coal that could fit in those curves, and that would be extremely problematic to accommodate given the needed cap we need to have on overall emissions. So clearly, what we've seen in terms of Xi's announcement at the UN, what the EU is doing, we see the importance of international agreements, and hopefully maybe the United States will be able to rejoin the Paris Agreement. But obviously one of the questions I was going to ask, but we don't have enough time for, is what might be the implications of a Trump versus Biden victory, but we don't have enough time to touch on that very important question. So what I would like to do is really just have each of you maybe give a 31 minute sort of summing up point, and then we'll move ahead with closing this very interesting event. Why don't we start with you, Ranjit?
Thanks, Philip. I mean, I think I'm sort of coming back to my thesis now. I think global action is critical. And what I mean by that is you need to engage countries like China and a number of large developing countries in this. It's not that this engagement is not taking place, but it needs to be taken up a few notches. I mean, it's not to say that much of, I mean, I'm looking at the discussion thread and questions, and there are a lot of valid questions here, a lot of valid concerns on how China has handled some of these issues and where China stands on these issues. But I think it's important to engage them. I am, and then you talked about the US elections. I hope the US gets somebody who's willing to engage in many of these debates, is to engage China. You don't have to accept whatever China comes up with and where the direction it's taking them or the world in. But I think it's important to engage them. And I think what we would need in terms of a leadership is somebody who can. And this would be true whether it's in Europe, whether it's in anywhere else in the world. There are a number of challenges, and Sarah and Shang-Jin have spoken about them. Yes, there are big strides we need to make on carbon capture and storage. There will be big issues to discuss in what the transition will be. I don't think that the transition to zero carbon is necessarily apparent either in the European Union or in China. So the direction matters, and I think I'll come back to, I think both China and the rest of the world are sort of going to, to use the Chinese phrase again, cross the river by feeling the stones. And I think the stones that we're going to feel, and we will need to feel over the next few years, will be critical. And what comes out of the US elections will be a big stone. So yes, we might just step off the wrong side of the riverbank and sink, or we might actually land on a stone that will take us forward. And I certainly hope that that is the direction the US elections and the world is going to go with, because I think it's such an important challenge that we just cannot afford to get this wrong. So let me stop there.
We can't afford to drown. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you very much. And apologies again for all the technical difficulties. I'll try to get this in before I get kicked off the internet again. My colleague, Jude Blanchett, has a really great saying, which is China is not 2 feet tall, China is not 10 feet tall, but they are 6'9". And so that means they're a formidable competitor. And I actually think that that's a really important and positive thing. I think one of the most positive dynamics coming out of this conversation, and the fact that China is playing the role that it's playing in the sort of climate change evolution, is that we don't just have the world of developed economies taking on this question. We've got sort of the capabilities and the strategic thinking and all of the sort of industrial strategy that Ranjit brought to bear in his presentation.
in China sort of facing down this issue. And I think that's a really important thing. I think the second really important thing is that, we've seen a lot of the necessary changes that we needed to see in the real economy to make clean energy opportunity a place where we can really compete. And so I think it's really important to be productive about these dynamics. And I think, there's obviously a better answer for climate change in the US election. But I think, when you look at what everybody who invests $1 in the energy industry knows today is they know that tomorrow it needs to be cleaner than it is today. And so that's the arc of the narrative in the real economy. We really need to make sure that our politics and our leadership and our competition sort of continues to move in that direction. And I think they're actually quite positive signs. And we just need to think about how to take advantage of making the most of them.
Great, thanks. No, I mean, and in some ways, what we've also seen, China became too big an emitter and too big an economy, really, to continue to evoke the flexibility of a developing country. The atmosphere just can't afford that. Shang-Jin?
So whatever China has declared to do in terms of the ambition in domestic emission is important for the world, but that's not enough. And for the world, we need to look beyond that. And let me mention two things. One is, when we say, China has been the largest consumer of energy, that statement is technically correct, but it's also misleading in an important way. That is, given that China has been the world's biggest manufacturing power so far, a big chunk of China's usage of energy is to produce something to satisfy other countries' demand. As China is transitioning away from being more dependent on manufacturing, becoming, manufacturing is progressively accounting for a smaller share of GDP. If the world demand for energy-based product has not declined, that means some other country will step in. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, country in Latin America will start to produce more of those products. Their competitive advantage responds to what China is choosing to do to less. So therefore, from a global point of view, we need to keep eyes on overall picture, and then we need to get the price of using energy, greenhouse gas emission right, and that requires paying attention to this sort of global reallocation of the energy-based production. That's one point. The second point is that the importance of China for global energy and climate change management again goes beyond just what China does within its border. But on a positive side, many things that China does in the border can create a positive spillover to other countries, and we need to also work with China and trying to develop more of those things. IGCC technology, a technology that has the potential, once the cost problem and technical problem is solved, to convert the fossil fuel usage into a zero carbon emission technology. Is an example of things that potentially that we should do more of this. And tradable permits is another example that I think eventually the world would have to have some combination of those things to complement renewable energy in order to transition to a world, for the world as a whole to be carbon neutral. We need to have a combination of those things.
Thanks for that, Shang-Jin. You actually, invoked the image from the American Civil Rights Movement of eyes on the prize. But we're also running out of time. We're running out of time in terms of this event, and we're running out of time in terms of managing our emissions. So thank you again to our speakers for joining us today. It was really a fascinating discussion, very varied views, some interesting convergence of views. And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in and for your questions. And also, it's important for you to note that our panelists did have a chance to look at the questions and it really informed some of their answers. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. Our next event, Environmental Justice, Housing and Energy, will be held Tuesday, October 27th at noon Eastern Daylight Time. For a full calendar of events, visit us online. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.